Well, everyone seems to be dialing in from across Canada and even beyond. I'm speaking to you from Toronto, and I would like to begin today's session by acknowledging the land where we live and work and recognizing our responsibilities and relationships where we are. As we are meeting and connecting virtually today, I encourage you to acknowledge the place you occupy. I am and Maitri is on the historical territory of the Huron-Wendat, Petun, Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the New Credit Indigenous peoples. This territory is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and the Ojibwe and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the lands and resources around the Great Lakes. Today, we're going to talk about how to best address the growing color-coded inequality for Indigenous peoples, peoples of color, Black Canadians. What are the institutional, structural, and systemic impacts of racism, faithism, and related inequality in education, housing, justice, health, and employment? We are living in a time of heightened awareness, heightened public discourse on these issues, and they have never been so important. They have always been with us. It is just our attention is laser focused at this time. So it is the time to have this conversation, perhaps overdue. How can individuals, groups, and organizations engage in effective trust building, allyship, partnership development, and advocacy to build on our successes, maintain hard-won gains, and bring about needed change? In today's session, our four presenters will break down 5 good ideas for better walking the talk on racial equity and delivering more effectively on racial justice in Ontario and on racial justice in our organizations. Our guests today are Lisa Francis, who is the Interim Director at the Black Legal Action Center, Avi Go, who is the Clinical Director at the Chinese and South Asian Legal Clinic. Samia Hassan is the Executive Director at the Council of Agencies Serving South Asians, and Shalini Kannanur is the Executive Director at the South Asian Legal Clinic of Ontario. They are all also members of the Steering Committee of Colour of Poverty, Colour of Change, which is an Ontario-wide social change network. For their full bios and details about today's session, please download the handout which Areta has posted in the chat room. We put the link to it there. On the handout, you will also find today's 5 good ideas and resources. It is now my pleasure to welcome Avi, Lisa, Samia, and Shalini. Please, over to you.
Thank you. And thank you very much, Maitri, for inviting us here today. Police killings of Indigenous and Black people have been happening in Canada for a very long time, but it took the killing of an American, Mr. George Floyd, in May 2020 to open the eyes of Canadians to the painful reality of racism that Indigenous peoples, Blacks, and other racialized communities have lived with in this country for more than a century. In Canada, Indigenous peoples and Blacks are disproportionately represented amongst fatalities caused by police. They are overrepresented in the criminal justice system, the child welfare system, and the prison population. And as the virus of COVID-19 spread across North America, so has a virus of anti-Asian racism. As opportunistic politicians on both sides of the 49th parallel blame the coronavirus on an entire race, and thereby unleashing an unprecedented level of hate, which results in harmful and, as we have seen recently, deadly consequences on people of Asian descent. These are but some of the ugly facts of racism that many Canadians are now being forced to confront. But it will be wrong if all we learn from the past year is that there are people who harbor hate and racist views towards Indigenous peoples and people of color, while ignoring the very deep-seated and entrenched forms of systemic racism in all of our institutions, in government, laws, policies, and programs, which have resulted in equally devastating consequences on racialized communities as those caused by individual acts of racial violence. People of color are 2 to 6 times more likely to live in poverty in Canada. We experience systemic racism and intersection discrimination on the basis of sex and other forms in the labor market. As a result, we have higher unemployment rates despite having higher labor market participation rate. Racialized men are 24% more likely to be unemployed than non-racialized men, while racialized women are 43% more likely to be unemployed than non-racialized men. The gender divide has grown that much more over the last year, but just as before, it's women of color who are bearing the brunt of the pandemic-triggered job loss. Racialized people are also more likely to be working precarious jobs, earn less income, and work part-time. COVID-19 has exposed and exacerbated pre-existing racism that has long robbed racialized folks their sense of dignity and their opportunity to the best of who they could be. The pandemic has shown a light on the plight of some of our most marginalized in our society, including migrants and others with precarious immigration status who put their lives on the line so that the rest of us can get fed and carry on with our lives in the safety of our home. So at this moment of collective awakening, it is incumbent upon all of us to look deeply into our hearts and mind, reflect upon our own actions, and ask ourselves, how can we make the difficult but necessary change to truly build back better? And for those of us who work in the nonprofit sector and provide services to some of the most disadvantaged among us, we also have the added responsibility to make sure that the institution that we work with is fully committed to dismantling racism and oppression, both within our agency and in the broader society. So to that end, we are offering 5 ideas to help build community capacity to work towards racial equity and racial justice. And with that, I'm going to ask Lisa to take us take us to the first idea. Thank you.
Thank you so much, AV. Appreciate that. Okay, so I mean, certainly Canada is an extremely diverse country. It's becoming increasingly diverse. Ontario is certainly very culturally dynamic. When I was in high school, we were documented in the local newspaper as having one of the most diverse populations in the Toronto District School Board at that time. We had a representation of something like, I think it was about 90 different countries represented in that particular high school. So I was very used to seeing and interacting with people from all walks of life. I met people from countries that I had never even heard of until I first met them. It was kind of refreshing, to be honest. I mean, looking back now, I don't think that my high school, they may have been ahead of the game by collecting that particular data. I don't know if that was their goal at the time to, in order to deal with racial and ethnic disparities. But I do know that by having that information, it could certainly have been helpful in responding to and adjusting to the community needs. Amy was really good a moment ago about pointing out some well-documented statistics in the labor force. So I'm sure that we can conclude that eliminating racial and ethnic disparities in the labor force is certainly an issue worth looking into. It certainly help improving the equity and the quality of life for racialized people, especially those who are more highly overrepresented in precarious work, such as migrant workers and minimum wage earners. So if it's important to make and measure progress toward addressing racism and addressing racial disparities in employment, and we certainly will need systems in place to gather far-reaching and reliable and consistent data. But I think there's more to just data collection itself, right? Collecting disaggregated data. I think what we really kind of need to take a look at is we need to be able to identify the nature and the reasons and the extent of the disparities. I mean, we ought to be able to quantify and then qualify the level of improvement efforts and monitor the progress of change towards more equalization. Most of the disparities, I believe, exist because of systemic racism, anti-Black racism, and colonization, including supremacist type attitudes that sort of provide for this institutionally created and then reinforce comfortable spaces for the dominant culture to sort of thrive at top level executive positions, while the so-called minorities sort of dwell at lower level, entry level roles with these very low glass ceilings. I really can't think of any labor market, industry, or even professional field where it's not managed and controlled by members of the dominant culture. And what I'm talking about is primarily white males. If we think about why we even collect disaggregated race-based and other socioeconomic data, and why it's important and why we're even having this conversation, it's because we intuitively and factually, we know that things are just unfair, right? I was in a webinar last week, a panel discussion where Avi actually, she mentioned a statistic that was interesting to me. It was something like racialized women earn, 58 cents for every dollar that non-racialized men earn. You know, systemic racism is really the truth behind institutional biases and then the policies and then the practices that provide a certain level of privilege to some, but then create barriers for others. So we need to be talking about disparities, not only on the basis of race, you know, being Black or Indigenous or otherwise racialized, but also talk about, you know, gender roles and other societal factors and biases that make it a lot harder for people, for instance, with disabilities or people who are transsexual and people who are sort of classified in other types of minority groups to sort of hold and maintain these long-term and top-tier roles, right? Color of Poverty has a resource, which I believe may be provided to you as part of this presentation. And it talks about some interesting provincial stats, and I'll share some of them. Okay, so people of color make up over 40% of sewing, textile, and fabric industry workers. Over 36% of taxi, limo, and limo drivers are racialized. Over 42% of racialized people are factory workers. Yet and still, racialized people make up only 3% of executives and 1.7% of organizational board of directors. You know, those disparities seem quite evident to me. So I'm not really sure why, you know, there seems to be this level of discomfort in talking about or even documenting data that we mentally note anyway. We kind of already know and we see that, you know, how many men are in executive roles, how many women are nurses, how many South Asians work in the field of IT, how many young Black people work at Walmart. I mean, we see these things on a regular basis. We know them to be true, whether or not we have the exact data. But I simply think that if we need to just do better and know more, collect more information to sort of better understand what's going on in our society, you know, where our tax dollars can be more effective, how government funding priorities can be best allocated. I think we need to really be more mindful and have more thoughtfulness to go into collecting information about the things that influence our opportunities and our access in every system, every institution, every industry that, you know, drives our workforce and then shapes our society, including taking a deeper look at how policies are written and, you know, really importantly, how the practices are put into place, and then what priorities become evident when we take a look at how programs are created, especially programs within the nonprofit sector. You know, those are some of the things that when we're talking about disaggregated data, we really need to take a look at how collecting data can sort of lead to an understanding that can provide more of a fairness and an equilibrium when we're dealing with who gets the jobs, who maintains the roles, who, you know, calling the shots, and how we can sort of spread the love in the workplace and have everybody kind of eat from that piece of the pie, where there's not these huge disparities where some are overprivileged and some are just so underserved.
Thank you. So I will talk about the second idea, and I will build on what Lisa has already said. And I think that key points, one of the key points anyways, that Lisa has been making is about how, like, a lot of the practices, policies that are within our institution may not be obviously discriminatory. So there's a lot of hidden biases, right? And in fact, that's oftentimes that's how systemic racism occurs. It's when institutions have hidden institutional biases that privilege one group and disadvantage another group. And so we need to understand how it works and what it looks like in order for us to dismantle it. And so I think the second idea, which is related to the idea of the collection of race-based, disaggregated race-based data, is that we need to incorporate a racial equity and racial justice lens in the development and evaluation of policies, budgets, programs, practices, cultures, both internally and externally. So for instance, in a not-for-profit setting, what we could do is to make sure having, a lens to make sure, for instance, the ways a program is delivered do not create any artificial barriers for racialized groups or other marginalized groups to access. And of course, you need to collect race-based data in order for you to track the impact of your policies and programs, et cetera, with related performance measures and assessment in order to make visible any color-coded inequities and disparities, and then you can address them. And having a racial equity lens would also allow you to review, for instance, as Lisa has pointed out, who are among the decision makers at your agency, whose voices are being heard, and whose opinions count the most. Having such a lens would also ask, allow us to ask, are we spending more time serving, let's say, a certain population because that's always been the case, or because these are the people who need our service the most? And we need to also ask in the design of our policies and practices, have we considered the impact of these policies on racialized folks? Are there intended or unintended consequences that will exacerbate any pre-existing disparities? How does unconscious bias enter into the decision-making process, not only at the management level, but also on the front line? And do you have a process in place to provide a regular evaluation to make sure whatever programs you set up to promote equity are actually doing the job they are intended to do? So these are just some of the questions, issues that we can examine through a race equity lens. And there are a lot of tools out there for this kind of assessment. So I'm just randomly give you an example. It's the Racial Equity Impact Assessment Tools that was created by Race Forward. It's a US-based Center for Research and Action to Promote Racial Equity. It's also a home to the Government Alliance on Race and Equity, which is a national network of local government working to achieve racial equity for all. So even though GARE is a US-based network, the Ontario government, or at least the Anti-Racism Directorate, is actually a member of GARE. The founder is John Powell with the Othering and Belonging Institute at UC Berkeley. So I would strongly encourage you to find this assessment tool on raceforward.ca. So I'm now going to turn over to Shalini.
Lisa and AV. So I want to talk to you about our third idea, which is about intersectionality in your anti-racism and race equity work. And I know nowadays that we use that word intersectionality a lot in our work, but truly, 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 it is critical to take an intersectional approach to anti-racism work. And what does it really mean? What does it mean for us? So for me, intersectional discrimination or oppression arises out of the combination of various oppressions, which together produce something unique and distinct from any one form of discrimination standing alone. It allows us to see the distinct, different, and disproportionate ways in which anti-racism impacts different people in racialized and Indigenous communities. Without taking that type of approach, we will miss in our work the ability to respond in a more significant and nuanced way to anti-racism. For example, What are the specific sports for First Nations, Inuit, Métis, and Black women? As we think about recovery from COVID, an intersectional approach would allow us to approach our anti-racism work by really drilling down into who has been hit hardest, right? Not all people impacted by racism are impacted in the same way. And that is why an intersectional approach to race equity must form the framework of our practices in things like hiring, advancement, and board recruitment in organizations. Internal anti-racism policies in our organizations that don't account for intersectionality are not going to reach the most deeply impacted parts of our spaces and workforces. And also for us at Color of Poverty, a key tool for building a fair and equitable workplace is by creating strong employment equity policy rooted in intersectionality within your organizations. You know, we have volumes of data in Canada to confirm significant race inequity at all levels in almost all workplaces. Even now in our own legal clinic system, we are having conversations around the desperate need for employment equity. We cannot make the mistake as not-for-profit sectors to think that we are progressive on this issue, because we see time and time again that the data is not bearing that out. Our sectors are not immune, and in many cases, we have failed to be at the forefront of ensuring employment equity. Quite frankly, for me, pledges, statements, commitment documents, EDI programs, they are simply not enough. We need to move forward. Workplaces must make employment equity a mandatory framing for hiring, promotion, and board recruitment. Starting from the ground up with a clear policy at your workplace and seek out examples. I've looked at, for example, the City of Toronto employment equity policy. Set accountability measures to measure yourself by, and both Lisa and Avi have talked about that, and ensure transparency. Part of that work will be collecting disaggregated data on who you serve, and internally, what does your organization look like from the top down? Who is working there and who do you serve? What are the pay scales? What are the wage gaps? Who is advancing? You know, and while organizations are now placing anti-racism at the heart of their external work and looking outwards, they have to look inwards at their own workplaces. Your credibility in advancing anti-racism advocacy also rests on what you do internally in your own spaces. Finally, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in Idea 5, I want to say that externally, our organizations should also take up any opportunity possible to advocate for strong employment equity legislation federally, provincially, territorially, municipally, and center intersectional employment equity in our own workplaces and spaces. So I'm going to pass it on now, I think, to Sonia.
Thanks so much, Shalini. So I'll just take a few minutes to talk a little bit about something that we've been hearing a lot about over the last couple of months, especially since the killing of George Floyd. There's a lot of talk about allyship and what that looks like and how that can be practiced in a meaningful way. I was just part of another panel yesterday, and somebody brought up the terms transactional allyship versus relational allyship. And I just wanted to, all of the points that I'm going to make today is going to be pointing towards what relational allyship looks like, and we want to stay away from transactional allyship. So the first thing that we should do as organizations, or even at an individual level, is to find out where Black, Indigenous, and other racialized communities need our support. Instead of, I've seen a lot people guessing or trying to come up with ways of supporting on their own without even looking at what are the needs of the communities that need that support and how they would like to be supported, whether or not they would like to be supported, and what kind of supports are they looking for. So all of this information, again, has been documented and widely available by both racialized communities and Indigenous communities for non-racialized and non-Indigenous and non-Black folks. And one of the things that we've, again, been hearing and encountering is for people that want to practice allyship is asking racialized people or Black folks or Indigenous people to teach them about, what historical inequities that they faced, historical harms, and what ways that they can learn to support them. But it should be noted that the burden of education, I think that was something that was brought up at previous panels that we did together with the color of poverty, shouldn't be on the shoulders of people that have already faced these harms and inequities. It should be on the shoulders of people that are trying to practice the allyship. The second thing that I would mention is that if you're a non-Black, racialized, or non-Indigenous person or organization, we have to stop practicing being model minority. So I would say this for people that are non-Black and non-Indigenous. One of the things that that happens is when we practice being model minorities, we don't realize, but it's comes from a colonial system, and Lisa brought this up a little bit as well, where we are kind of judged based on our proximity to whiteness. And based on that, we're pitted against each other in seeing who is more white and who is the most model minority. So it's important to not play into that system, to be working in solidarity. So if you are a racialized organization, you are a racialized person, to make sure that you're looking at working in solidarity without, buying into this system of whiteness and trying to get, being pitted against other racialized communities. So once we have these two things down, then it's up to us to show up, to act, to endorse, to support, and to connect. And Shalini mentioned something really important, and it really gets on, the nerves of racialized communities, Black communities, and Indigenous communities, is when we see these statements that are being put out without any action being followed by them. So statements are great. They show solidarity, they show support, but what actions are you actually taking to move that forward? And a couple of things to realize. So once you're ready for that allyship, a couple of things to realize is to acknowledge that we're not being allies to take over that space from racialized communities or Black communities or Indigenous communities, but we're there to provide support. And once we're there to provide support, and it's also sometimes you may face rejection because Black communities or other racialized communities or Indigenous communities may not be ready to welcome you in their spaces that they've created. And I know, Lisa, you mentioned this in our previous panel as well. Sometimes we just need spaces for our own communities and for our own selves. So be prepared for that type of rejection if you're not being welcome to those spaces. And oftentimes the rejection comes from, again, historical inequities. And so the question is, where were you 10 years ago or 20 years ago? Or 30 years ago, 40 years ago, these inequities have been happening for a very long time, for hundreds of years. And so there is that feeling that we could have been supported a long time ago, but now, because this is kind of the sexy thing to do these days to support Black communities and Indigenous communities, a lot of organizations and corporations and individuals are kind of jumping the bandwagon and trying to support. So really looking at your intentions. What are your intentions? What are your actions? And how are you going to actually physically and meaningfully support racialized Indigenous communities? Just one thing I wanted to set out in terms of an example, in the setting of an organization. An allyship doesn't only have to mean that you're being allies in the presence of racialized communities. So if you have racialized or Indigenous staff, that you're just being allies to your own staff, but it should be beyond that. It should be people external to your organization. It should be things that you're doing to support communities. I know we've talked about in the last 3 points about doing things internally. Once you've got that down and you have done things to support your staff internally, also looking at how your organization supports racialized communities and Indigenous communities externally. So it should extend even from the people that benefit from your services. So people that are not benefiting from your services, people that you may be profiting from. What are some ways for you to give back to those communities that you're profiting from. And think about ways that you can create programs and policies to support the well-being and prosperity of those communities that you've been benefiting from, that you've been profiting from. So an example of that is to create mechanisms to distribute the resources and the profits that you've created. I know that there's so many companies out there that have made billions of dollars in profits over the last year, even during the pandemic, where we've seen racialized communities on the opposite side of the spectrum and really suffering economically. We've seen that for South Asian communities and Black communities, Indigenous communities, the unemployment rates are skyrocketing. The rates at which people are employed in precarious labor is disproportionate. So what are ways for organizations that are really invested in allyship and in supporting racialized communities, Indigenous communities, to allocate those resources, those billions of dollars that you're saving in profit to the communities that need it most? Thank you. Avi, I'll pass it back to you, or is it Shalini?
I think it might be me again. And I'm going to end us off with our fifth good idea. And so that's talking about something that sometimes can be a little bit scary for not-for-profit organizations, and that's lobbying governments for system level changes. So, over the past years, we've obviously been having a more robust conversation in Canada around race equity. And our last good idea is that we want organizations to take up the challenge to advocate for systems change. Many of us on this call and who will watch this are on the ground working with people in communities who are most deeply impacted by racism. As a sector, we should be at the forefront of advocacy on systems level changes to address systemic racism. While governments continue to fund projects in community to address racism and hate and push the work outwards, the reality is that systems level changes that must be made cannot only happen through these projects funded in community. Communities cannot solve systemic issues related to racism on their own. It just doesn't work that way. We don't have the power to fix the race wage gap, to legislate employment equity, to ensure that racialized people with no or precarious immigration status have access to income supports, to enforce employment discrimination in the law, to immediately address the continued appalling treatment of Indigenous people and children in Canada. And I can go on with a list of systemic racism that happens throughout Canada. These are systems changes. But what we have collectively the ability and the responsibility, in my view, to do is to lobby governments to make those changes, to advocate on the issues that are connected to the work that we do. And I know it sounds scary, in particular for organizations that are funded in ways that where they are told expressly that they cannot do advocacy as a piece of their funding or as because of their charitable status. But if you peel back the layers of those limitations, and I'm having that conversation on a board I'm sitting on at a not-for-profit right now, our proposal is not to do political advocacy. It is to advocate on race equity as it connects to our work. In so many cases, we are often in the best position to push out the stories of our communities that we work with, to push out the data that we collect on what is happening, the research that we are doing, and engage in all of those opportunities to advocate. But the question then becomes, how do you figure that out? It can be really overwhelming. I have to say that when I started at Salco, it was very hard to understand the landscape of how advocacy works in Canada and how to get involved. And to be frank, I still don't fully understand it. We have a very confusing way in which you have to insert yourself into these conversations. So what I will say is one starting point is to try to reach out to organizations like Color of Poverty, like Color of Change, to get information on the opportunities that we may be able to educate on that you can engage in. Look at, if you have a chance, the work of the Federal Anti-Racism Directorate, the work of the Provincial Anti-Racism Directorate, your own municipality's anti-racism or equity and diversity departments. Look at the opportunities that come out to speak up on those issues. Look at the things that come out in media that may concern the work that you do. So the other thing that I want to talk about is more of a contextual switch, and that is to really center advocacy as a fundamental part of your organization's work, which really leads to a change in the thinking about the way things come across your desk. Right. So what has changed for me in my own practice is I serve clients directly with legal service. But now when I see cases and I see the same thing happen over and over again, I am thinking about systems change. For example, my own casework in gender-based violence over the past year has increased by 35%. I am now thinking about how under-resourced and underserved racialized women are in our gender-based violence sector. So I will do the cases, but I am thinking about systems change. I think that is only possible for me because my organization mandates advocacy as part of my work plan. All of our organizations must try to build internal organizational capacity to actively advocate for support and change-making efforts. We are not going to see progression on racial equity and racial justice unless we collectively, loudly, and strongly choose to take the responsibility to include advocacy within our work. So I want to just end by saying that I am hopeful that you are going to take these 5 good, in my view, great ideas back to your own spaces, and that you will have meaningful conversations about putting them into action in the work that you do in your own workplaces and organizations. And I want to thank all of you for sharing your time and your energy with us this afternoon.
Well, I want to thank you. That was remarkable. The richness of the ideas. I agree, they're great. You've gone beyond. You've surpassed the 5 good ideas, but they also are so integrated. They are so part of one another, and they build on each other. And I think that it provides a bit of a roadmap for those who want to engage seriously on this in their organization, in their work, in their own advocacy. We've got a number of questions coming in. I'm going to go back up to the beginning. There was a few questions on data, and then it moves down a little bit. I think an interesting one on data, which was a conundrum when, I think going back, Lisa, when they were collecting race-based data when you were in high school. And the question is, some of our program participants are offended when they're asked about their race and economic information, and they're distrustful of how the information will be used. There has been debate about how does race-based data get used. Do you have any concerns about this kind of data collection? Are there any cons to collecting, or how do we mitigate against that, I guess?
Yeah, I think it's delicate for some, and I do understand that. I know that even at our own clinic system, we've been asked to, so I work at a clinic where we serve Black Ontarians. We're mandated to do that. So we still ask, we have to sort of verify because it's part of our mandate. And our explanations, and I frankly have had people, who are a little offended by it and want to know, well, but not so much offended about the question about race, but it brings up a little bit of, and I've have interacted with people who, it brings up a little bit of trauma surrounding race and nationality, and the fact that, they bring up the fact that we're stolen peoples from lands across the sea. So these some kind of things have come up when asking the question. So I understand that even, it might not seem like it would be an issue for someone from a Black community to ask another person from a Black community about how they identify racially, but it does happen. And now you're looking at somebody outside of somebody else's race, asking that same question. Some of the challenges are when, I think race in general in Canada is sort of hard to talk about, right? We have all kinds of reasons why that is. Historically, contemporarily, it's not the easiest thing to say to somebody, so where are you from? What's your race? It brings up stuff for people. I get that. But when we ask in our organization or we're asking, and you have to explain to people, it's because we want to be able to better serve. So if we understand the dynamic of the people that we're dealing with, the people who are calling, we can better create programming. So I'll give you an example. So like I said, I work at the Black Legal Action Center, and we deal with Black Ontarians who are in low income categories and who are in need of legal assistance based on having an anti-Black racist experience, right? So I had a call from somebody one time that asked, well, how do you serve people who are in the LGBTQ community or transgender people? And I was like, well, we don't do anything different. As long as they identify as Black, we support them. And they have an issue that's anti-Black racism in nature, we support them. We don't have anything different that we do based on that. But then we got to thinking, I know exactly how many people who were transgender or in the LGBT community we do serve. I actually do have that data because we have actually collected it just internally. So it got us thinking, well, maybe we should have something, but we would only know that if we asked the information. We would only know that if we collect it and consider it. And then once it's collected and it's considered, then we can go forward. But I think to sort of, that's some of the explanations that you have to give people, is that we collect the data, we ask the information so that we can better serve you. We can understand your needs and the community needs, and then the provincial needs, and then the global needs. If we don't ask the questions, we don't know. We can't make assumptions. And as Samia, actually alluded to the fact, sometimes we make assumptions about where do we allocate? If we don't ask the proper, and we don't have to always reinvent the wheel, and we can always go to those who do have the information. We don't have to necessarily collect it all ourselves. We can ask, or we can reach out to Color of Poverty, and do they have the information, and then use that internally. And that, just to explain that to people, that if we don't ask these questions, they may seem a little uncomfortable, but it's just a natural conversation about, we want to better serve the public, and to do that, we have to ask these questions. And we need you to help us.
It also gives you the evidence to do the advocacy that Shalini was talking about. I mean, it's all tied in together.
The advocacy, write the grants and get the funding, all of that.
All of it. And to be able to say when change hasn't happened.
Right.
Exactly. That we're 25 years into, I think of Black high school dropouts. The number hasn't changed in 25 years.
No.
So if we hadn't collected the data, we wouldn't be able to say nothing has changed in 25 years.
But again, it's not just collecting the data. It's, what are you doing with the information?
Exactly. Oh, you're absolutely right. You're right.
Changing. It's the practices are not changing.
Exactly.
Data is the same.
No. Yeah. No. Totally agree.
Yeah.
I have another question related to data, and it's open to anyone. The province is currently moving forward with race-based data collection in the areas of justice, child welfare, education. How can we get them and other key actors to adopt an all-of-government institution, service provider approach to race and other equity-based data collection? So this taps into the advocacy piece as well. So who wants to take that away?
I'll start.
Great.
So I think that, we were actually, Color of Poverty was instrumental in making sure that the province adopted the anti-racism legislation. We did a draft and sent it to them and pushed for the creation of the secretariat. But interestingly, when the act was first adopted, the Ministry of Health was exempted from the data collection, right? But as we know, since the pandemic, even the Ministry of Health has come around and acknowledged that we must collect race-based data. So if the Toronto Police, of all people, are now collecting race-based data, then there's no reason why any other ministry or department will not do so. Like health, police, criminal justice, child welfare, those are really the toughest ones, right? To get them to agree, right? So I think that it's really a question of, sort of like trying to get the government to make sure the legislation, because, they started with these agencies, but they will supposedly will expand to other areas as well, right? So I think it's just a matter of time. The problem is that we just learned the budget has given the secretariat what $1.6 million. And Samuel, you may want to add your comment, but it may not be enough to do the work that is needed.
Yeah, just to add, we were just talking about this earlier today, and I actually was confused if it was million or billion because I thought it was a typo, to be very honest with you. I think it's just tokenism, to be honest. It's not nearly enough.
So here's a question that builds on that. And now, in terms of knowing that something has happened, when you have evidence and nothing happens. So here's knowing that racism was investigated and documented at the HWDSB Trustees Committee and School Board. In your professional opinion, how do we hold them accountable when they refuse to hold themselves accountable? We as a community find this so disheartening. Can you provide some advice? So it's out there. We have the evidence, and there's I think, Shalini, to your point, like where's the path toward accountability here? How do you navigate that?
I mean, that is a huge frustration, probably for all of the panelists on this call, because we have a lot of evidence already and a lot of non-action, as Lisa has said, right? There are different ways. Some of the more pragmatic approaches that we've tried to take in our own work have been through the use of social media and media. There are mechanisms now for public, I don't want to call it shaming, but it's like public pressure that seem to be a lever to push people forward. I live in York Region, and it was the public pressure and using media and using social media that got movement on the York Region District School Board. Those issues had been going on for decades and longer, right? And so that's one piece. As lawyers, we think about ways in which the law can be used as a tool to push that forward. So there are potential for using the levers of the law to bring test cases to challenge the way decisions are made. Those, of course, are more complicated and take a lot longer, but sometimes we'll be able to have the impact that we want them to have. But a lot of it is around one of the things that I think is the hardest for all of us to do, which is community organizing. To be truthful, the most success I've had when I think about the forced marriage campaign that Salco was on the ground grassroots community organizing to raise the voices of the people impacted and have them get in front of decision makers at every possible opportunity, which takes real bravery on their part to be able to sit in such a vulnerable position and speak. But those are the things that worked the most for me. And I don't know if anyone else has any thoughts as panelists.
Okay, so we're past time. Just a note of time to everybody on the call, but we're going to go over because there's just so much more here. We will have a hard stop at 1:59, I promise you. But there's a couple of really great questions, and there's a couple that get into how do we do this as an organization? We're running an organization, like we're nonprofits. Many are, trying to do good work in the community, but inside there's work to be done, and a number of your comments spoke to that. This person asks a question, and I think it can be generalized. Do you have any advice for a non-manager staff person who is concerned about how the leadership and HR team are embarking on what they call an equity, diversity, and inclusion journey? Any tips for getting through to people who aren't doing the work on how they need to do this journey as an organization? So it's difficult because now you got the power relations, right? If you're a junior member of the team, or and you're trying to influence perhaps a not what you don't see as an authentic process that the organization's taking. Who wants to take it?
Can I speak on that first just a little?
Sure.
So I think if there's some level of discomfort of dealing with it, or you're not sure how to deal with it, just don't force it on yourself. Don't make yourself more uncomfortable than you have to. Go externally, hire somebody, consult with somebody who does do this work on a regular basis, who does understand, who can come into the organization and sit with you all and talk. When we're talking about, for instance, anti-Black racism, and you have the whole the Confronting Anti-Black Racism unit in Toronto, they have people who their job is to work with organizations and talk them through and walk them through strategies, understanding what anti-Black racism looks like, sounds like, what it is, and how to sort of manage it and deal with it, and then how to implement it into, or how to implement combating it or eliminating it or addressing it within their policies and practice. Just have somebody, have an expert or consultant come in and work with you. If that's not an option, maybe somebody else has another option, but I think that would be sort of a starting point, at least to try to get an external person who's sort of not who's a little bit more subjective, who doesn't have to come in, who's outside of what the agency's doing, but can take a sort of a big picture look at it, and not someone who's not already more invested into how what's happening in the organization, but taking a broader look at it and giving ideas based on a more outside look.
And
What
just
about
quickly to
the-
add,
okay.
sorry, Avi, I'm just going to take 10 seconds. In addition to that, I think what I've heard in other discussions is to look at other organizations that are similar to yours, that have done the anti-racism, building the foundation of anti-racism in their organization, as opposed to hiring one person to do the diversity and inclusion work, and how they've done it. And talk to that organization and use their best practices in your work. Sorry, go ahead, Avi.
Yeah, I think these are all good ideas, but also, are there any allies? Samia talked about allied earlier. Are there people within the organization that will be sympathetic to your position, who may be in a better position to raise it without the same level of fear of reprisal, or, so if there are allies from within, maybe also speak to those people as well.
So that leads to a couple of, there was 3 or 4 questions on allyship. I think you sparked something in those comments, which is great, because it's a term that gets thrown around, and it's important to put meaning to it. And I think you did a good thing in sort of separating between transactional and relational. And someone wanted to hear a bit more about, what does transactional mean then? Like, how do I sort of navigate the difference between that? And then someone else asked this question, which I think is important, which is that recognizing that BIPOC communities and experts don't actually owe their time, ideas, or support to organizations seeking to develop an anti-racism action plan. We've heard a lot about the importance of developing relationships to make sure that our allyship work is a reflection of community need. Can you talk or speak a bit to what might be required of a potential ally as they start to build those partnerships? So I guess just digging in a bit more to the layers of allyship.
Sure, I can start with the first part, and then if anybody wants to take a stab at the second part. So I think the very traits of a transactional allyship are really apparent. It's allyship that is done, that is very self-serving. It is temporary in nature. So you just find a moment where there's an immediate need. We saw that last year in the summer. There was a lot of rallies and things happening, and people just went and showed up, and that was it, right? So there's nothing beyond that. Then what happens is you require racialized people or Indigenous people to explain to you what their problems are. You listen to their problems, you're just there, but then there's really nothing that comes out of it. It may just be a checkbox kind of solution if it's an organization, for them to put out that statement, and they check that box and say, okay, we're supporting, racialized and Indigenous communities. So, and I know there was another question, like, is there any options of transactional allyship which can be beneficial? And in my personal opinion, as a racialized woman, I would rather not have any allyship at all than to have a transactional allyship where it's just self-serving to the people that already have privileged positions, and just to make themselves feel good, right? So why have that burden of trying to educate people and trying to bring people along your struggles if it's just to serve themselves?
Okay, all right, so we are at 1:58 by my clock. Are there any final comments from the 4 of you? You've done such a spectacular job of navigating this and shaping the conversation for people working in the nonprofit, and giving ideas and things that they need to work on and work through. Are there last comments?
And we are certainly open to doing a follow-up session if that, proves necessary.
Mhm.
It's-
I think one of the absences here is that we did not include an Indigenous perspective, and I think that's that needs to be here as well, fundamentally. It's a foundation. It's the colonial experience of Canada has shaped so much of what we are working through here. So I think that is perhaps the next step of the conversation. Yes, Shalini.
I really want to encourage everyone who's here today to really think about in what way you can take iterations of these 5 ideas back into your workspaces. And I want to acknowledge that, I sit as the executive director and a manager, so I'm in a position of privilege and power to make those changes in my organizations. I want to acknowledge that that's not the case. I've been an employee too, and I know what it feels like to be in spaces where people don't want to hear that. They don't want to hear the issues around racism in particular. And so I want to acknowledge that, but in any way that you can bring those conversations back to your boards in ways that are safe for you to do so, I really want to encourage people to do that.
And that is officially the last word. Thank you, Shalini. Thank you, Avi. Thank you, Shalini. Thank you, Samia. Thank you, Lisa. That was absolutely terrific. More than 5 great ideas.